okay, so do I have to do the Trooper two-step in North Carolina? And the same one right before that was a guy from Virginia says, do I have to do the Trooper two-step in Virginia? Actually, a guy messaged me on Facebook who I know, this guy Ken, and he said, I'm in another instructor's course. Do I have to do it in Virginia? I said, he goes, did the law change? I go, you've never had to do it in Virginia. What happened was you went to a course being taught by somebody from a state that requires this to be done, or that's how they've resolved the issue of voluntariness and not being constrained, and that voluntary consent could not be ever given while in custody in those states. And then it just becomes a habit and actually a moot gesture. Would you agree that you don't have to do this? You're just being told to do this because the guy who taught you from the other state, that's what they have to do. And respect. And it's not that I'm saying that these instructors did it intentionally. They're probably not taking into account that, okay, it doesn't have to be in Virginia, right? Just like I take into account when I go to Kansas, I'm like, hey, you got to do this in Kansas, okay? You don't got to do it in Jersey. You don't got to do it in Virginia. You don't got to do it in Florida. You have to do it in Kansas. Here's where it says why. They actually prescribe in Kansas. I taught there last week. They literally say exactly, I sent the case law to you.
Yeah.
Exactly what they would suggest would have been a better way to go about getting voluntary consent in a case that was overturned at the Supreme Court level. So
yeah, that Trooper two-step issue, it's not an issue that the U.S. Supreme Court has ever explicitly held one way or the other, and I highly doubt it's something that's ever going to come to their attention. But what the case that's going to control on this is it's Bustamonte and Robinette. Two U.S.
You know how to say the first part of that? How do you say it? Is it Schneckloth?
It's Schneckloth.
Schneckloth. I could never get that right.
I think it's Schneckloth.
Schneckloth v. Bustamonte.
And so what those two cases deal with, Schneckloth talks about it's the totality of the circumstances for consent. It just has to be voluntary. It doesn't have to be knowing. Okay, it's not like a waiver of your Miranda rights. It's not a waiver of your rights. It's just a voluntary act. So it just has to be given voluntarily. That's what Schneckloth is about. And then Robinette talks about what constitutes a break in custody from a traffic stop transitioning to a consent encounter or consensual contact. You don't have to have the Trooper two-step. It's just something you can do to show that a reasonable person would think they're free to leave. I think there's a lot of other ways to do it. Telling them they're free to leave is a great thing to do. Although Robinette says it's not required. I think what better way to convince a reasonable person they are free to leave is if you tell them they're free to leave.
Yeah, if you're in a state that you do that. I mean, you don't need to play that game in New Jersey. You're on your investigative detention. New Jersey said, as long as you explain it the way we suggest that you explain it, you don't have to tell people they're free to leave to get voluntary consent.
You got to give them all their documents back. There just has to be a clear division that the traffic stop component of this is over, and now we're transitioning to just two people having a conversation. Is basically what it is.
But if you had now existing reasonable suspicion of criminal activity, you wouldn't need a break in that.
No, you don't. Yeah, you can just if during the course of my traffic stop, the temporal course, the time of my traffic stop, I develop reasonable suspicion of some other type of activity, probably criminal activity, then the whole Trooper two-step, Robinette, Schneckloth, it's all out the window, because now I can detain the person and investigate this new suspicion. I don't have to end the traffic stop. I'm expanding the traffic stop to a different matter. So
and
the RS is there. It changes the game.
Yes, but in those other states like Kansas, even with the reasonable suspicion, they still want that break in custody consider voluntary consent to be voluntary, because somebody in custody could never, even investigative detention, could never be voluntary. So you've got to play this dumb game.
Completely contrary to the Supreme Court case law. United States versus Watson makes it clear.
And by the way, if you actually check Watson in Kansas, which I did, they're like, yeah, you can't do this here. You can't do they're like, you'd really have to cover your butt if you had somebody in custody to grant consent. You'd have to cover your butt tremendously in Kansas. And I imagine it would be a long explanation and the same question 14 times. You understand that we're not going to do it. It's got that's what I think. And again, I have this in my mind. Maybe there's another solution. Unfortunately, in Kansas, because the Trooper two-step was done there, they're stuck with it. It almost has binding ruling on it. But in other states where they consider it, some states say, like, look, that's one way to do it. I'm curious if there's another way to do it, and I think there is.
Yeah, back their documents. I like you're free to leave. I like to have that set in there. although it's not required. When I teach recruits, that's what I tell them. You're free to leave. Tell them you're free to leave. Give them their documents back. I like the lights being off on the car behind you. The strobe lights, turn those off. Before you walk up there. Just would a reasonable person think that the traffic stop is over? Sure.
You're talking about to reinitiate a consensual encounter?
Yeah. To reinitiate it, there doesn't have to be a physical break in custody. That's where the trooper two-step comes in. That's the physical break. Oh, I've walked away. Now I've turned around and I'm coming back trying to reinitiate a contact. That's just simply not necessary under the Fourth Amendment. It's something. It's a factor. Certainly is a factor to consider. But I just, I think it's kind of silly, to be honest with you.
Yeah, no, I agree. And you know what? Even some states like South Carolina, they had a piece of case law I read. It's very interesting, and they said this trooper or the sheriff did this thing that we've never seen. We don't know why he did that. And I wish I could have been there. I said, because he took a training course from a guy or heard from a guy who went to a training course. This is how we're supposed to do it, who came from a state where it's required. That's why he was in South Carolina. South Carolina Supreme Court said, you don't got to do this. Just getting consent would have been fine as long as it was voluntary consent and knowing and intelligent, whatever the requirements are.
Not even
that would have been plenty.
Free of coercion. That's the standard.
Yeah, that's it. Yep. And listen, some states require a very small standard for what's a voluntary consent, and some states they don't like consent. Some acknowledgments of a unequivocal response, which means a yes or a no. They're like, he said, that was a yes. You bring it to another state, they're like, yeah, you needed a yes and an acknowledgement of it. So it's interesting.
And this is another area where state law comes into play. I imagine the Kansas stuff you're talking about is going to be decided under the Kansas Constitution, because that stuff's clearly not required by the Fourth Amendment, and that's fine. Some states do require you to tell the person you have a right to refuse. Is New Jersey one of those states?
Yep. U.S. State versus Johnson, 1975. They will not consider a consent voluntary unless they advise the right to refuse.
That is a requirement under the New Jersey Constitution. And that's
correct.
There's quite a few states that have that. To go back to your Virginia question, someone was asking you about the Virginia and the trooper two-step. Virginia is one of about less than 10, maybe 8 or 9 states that have expressly held by their Supreme Court that we follow the Fourth Amendment lockstep. There is no deviation in Virginia. Our search and seizure provision of our Constitution mirrors that of the Fourth Amendment. There's another handful of states that say that. So it's so easy in Virginia. I don't even teach Virginia constitutional law. I don't talk about Virginia appellate cases very often. I talk about Fourth Circuit and I talk about the Supreme Court when I teach Virginia.
Excellent.